Hey guys, welcome back to good old Lawrence County High School here for another edition of economics here in our classroom. This week we've been looking at a couple of big ticket items. We looked at the 4 factors of production, which are extremely important in understanding how economics works. Yesterday we were looking at the circular flow of income. Today we're going to focus on GDP, or gross domestic product. Now you've had this concept before. If you recall from watching the crash course videos, they went through GDP there, but I just want to give you my spin on it and make sure you understand it. So when we look at gross domestic product, or GDP, we know it's the total value in dollars of all final goods and services produced in a country in 1 year. A couple things to think about here. Final goods. A final good is something that is completely assembled when you purchase it. And here's what I want you to think about. Let's say that you're an automobile manufacturer, and in order to build the car you're going to sell to people, you need lots of different components. So you may buy a windshield from one factory, you may buy a transmission from some other factory, you may buy seats from someone else. When you buy that windshield from the company that makes windshields, that windshield alone does not count into GDP. The transmission does not count into GDP. But once you put it all into the car and the car becomes a finished product and you sell the car, then that car counts towards the GDP. Because if you were to count the windshield when it came from the windshield factory to the car, and you were to count the transmission when it came as GDP, then you're going to wind up counting those things twice. Once when they're coming to the car to be assembled, and then once you sell the car. So in order to understand this, it's a final good, something that is completely assembled. And when that is sold, that counts towards GDP. So it's all the final goods and services produced in a country, and every country does their own measure of GDP, in a period of 1 year. Why do we do this? It measures a country's economic activity. So we can see, we can compare one country to another country to see who has the highest GDP and what that tells us. We can compare our country to itself. Let's see what our GDP is here as opposed to maybe 7 years ago. Is our economy doing better? Is it getting worse? So it's a good way to measure basically the output of an economic system. Well, and like we are also saying here, it's also used to gauge a country's standard of living. So you can look at countries with high GDP and you can pretty much say, well, the citizens who live there probably have a pretty high standard of living, as opposed to a country with a low GDP, and maybe they're not very efficient at using the natural resources they have. Maybe they don't even have any natural resources, or it's a third world country. So the standard of living is usually not very high in a country with low GDP. The GDP in the United States in 2018 was $21 trillion. So my question to you is there anyone with a higher GDP on average? Or are we the highest? Well, the answer is we are number one. This is what it looks like. That's what $21 trillion looks like written out. And we have the highest GDP in the world. If we compare what our GDP looks like to other countries in a pie chart here, here's the United States with roughly, we can say about 25% of all GDP. Really, it's 23.6. So we are by far number one. Who comes in second? Well, if you look at China. China with about 15.5% of all the share of the global economy. Then things start to drop off drastically. We see Japan with 5.7%, Germany with 4.6%, and then we even have to start combining countries to even get a pretty good slice of the pie. Countries 6 through 10, whatever they are, make up 12, basically 13%. Then the next 10 countries make up 13.3%. Then you have your poor countries here at the bottom. The other 173, and them combined only make up 21%. So think about it like this: the United States GDP is greater than the bottom 173 countries all put together. If you want to look at it in a chart like this, maybe this gives you a different perspective. You see the United States is number one, and they're way over here. $21.5 trillion looks like this as compared to China's $14 trillion, Japan, Germany, then you see the UK, and it drops on down to the last one in the top 10 is Canada with a measly $1.8 trillion GDP. If we look at how we get GDP numbers, and we know gross domestic product, once again, is the total value of all final goods and services sold in the country in 1 year. But let's look at exactly what those goods and services are. And the first way we're going to get an indication of what this is through consumption. And guys, we are a consumer country. We consume more than any other country. And over my lifetime, I've probably seen society switch from being a country, or at least where I grew up, where people would reuse things over and over and over and keep things and continue to use them until they were worn out. And we switch gears now. If you think about it, something like a TV. What do you do when your TV stops working? Well, you simply throw it away and you go buy a new TV. You know, we don't really recycle a whole lot. We just like to buy new things. It makes us feel good to buy new things, and we feel like we're doing well, maybe financially, that we can afford to buy new things. So consumption. We are a consumer nation, the highest consuming nation. So the dollar value of consumer goods and services purchased by a household in 1 year. Think about that one more time. The dollar value of consumer goods and services purchased by a household in 1 year. So when you buy things like an Instapot, or you buy lawnmowers, or you buy services of someone giving you a nice shave here, which you can't really do anymore. This is consumption. And really a basic way to think about it is, remember, let's go back to the idea of the circular flow of income and households. We are households. What do we spend our money on? And it's this kind of stuff. When we consume, we buy stuff. Another measurement of GDP is investment. This is the money spent by firms to purchase capital equipment or other inventory. So going away from the households, now we're thinking like the businesses or the manufacturers, the firms, and when we have to have things like this bit of machinery to produce the good we have to have, or this is called a capital good, or we have to have inventory. If I'm going to run a shoe store, I need lots of shoes. So these are investments. This will also include residential construction. So if you're building houses to live in, that's all part of investment. A third component of GDP measurement, government purchases. And remember when we talked about the circular flow of income, we had households, we had firms, but right in the middle, who was also a big player, was the government. And the government was collecting income through taxes, but then the government was also buying things at both the product market and the factor market. So government spending on goods and services. So whenever the government purchased things like this, whatever you would call this tank of a thing, it's got a big gun on it, so it's going to shoot something. Or we purchase Jeeps for folks who deliver the mail in. I don't even know if the post office still buys these things or not, but they're cool. Excuse me. So anything that the government purchases is another measure of GDP. And the last one is net exports. So let's think for a second. Imports are things that come into our country from another country. Exports are things that we sell to other countries from here. So now we're talking about net. So this is the difference in dollars between the amount of foreign imports and the exports to other countries. That's to say, if we compare how much we ship to other countries with the amount of things we bring in from other countries, and we find what the difference is, that will be our net exports. In equation form, the dollar amount of exports minus the dollar amount of imports will give us our net exports, net meaning a total here. So we like to see if we are, ideally, we want to export more things than we import. If we export, we're sending our goods and services to other countries and we're taking their money. If we import, then we're bringing in goods and services from other countries, but yet we're sending them our money. So we want to keep our money here. So let's think about iPhones. Do we import or export iPhones? That's a tough question, but you have to think about it, and they're kind of a special cause. Apple is based in the United States, and all the brain power and all the thinking happens in the United States, but yet we have them produced in China because the cost of labor there is so much cheaper than what it is in the United States. But then once they're produced in China, they are shipped back to the United States and then they're sold here. So that's almost a trick question. But if we think about something like this, these beautiful Volkswagen Beetles, which were coming in probably fresh from Germany, and I guess that looks like this would have been the late 60s. So in fact, iPhones are something we export, but sweet Volkswagen Beetles would be something that we would import. Another thing to look at when we look at GDP is something called per capita GDP. The way you get per capita, that means you take the GDP and you divide it by the population. You take the total amount of all goods and services produced in the country in 1 year, it's going to be a big number, and you divide that by how many people are in your country. Why do we do this? Well, it's good to measure the productivity of a country's workforce. So if you have an astronomically high GDP, but then you have billions and billions of people, are they really being that productive? Where you might have a country with a much lower GDP, but they don't have that many people there, so they're doing much better per person. So when we look at per capita GDP, the darker shades are the countries with the higher per capita GDP, and as the colors fade to a lighter shade, this is where you see a lower GDP. Make note of the countries with a very low GDP, where you see the bright yellow. Where do you find those? Mostly in the continent of Africa. And you can, as we know, this is a very poor region. A lot of what we would say the third world countries are here and through this area as well. So we're going to see countries we consider to be poor with a low per capita GDP, and then we're going to see countries with a very dark shade, which we know has a high standard of living and a very high per capita GDP. So if we rank them, now my numbers are a couple of years old, and there's always a couple of sort of switch ranking out. But number one, per capita GDP. This is your final Jeopardy question. What do you think it is? United States? China? United Kingdom? No. The number one per capita GDP is Qatar. Qatar with $130,000 per capita GDP. You're going to say, well, what is Qatar? If you look it up, it's a very small country in the Middle East that produces natural gas. Lots of natural gas, but there's not a lot of people there. So even though their GDP isn't astronomical, their population is so low that by the time you divide the GDP by the population, they're ranked number one. Number two, what do you think it is? Wrong. Luxembourg at 100,000 per capita GDP. Best I recall, it seems like Luxembourg was big into banking, possibly insurance. I can't remember exactly what made them such a high GDP per capita. But once again, their GDP isn't astronomical, but there's not a whole lot of people there, so per capita. And just to get a feel, you think I'm going to throw number three up here, but I'm not. Let's look at the United States. If we're looking at per capita GDP, where do you think we rank? You ready? 13th. So even though we have $21 trillion worth of GDP, we also have 328 million people here. So by the time you do the math, that's only 60,000 per capita GDP. So the United States drops quite far down. Well, we shouldn't say quite far. We're still in the top 15, but not number one. But once again, this is per capita. And just let me clear up. If we're talking raw GDP, we have more than anyone, but per capita, not so much. One of the last things we'll look at today is something called division of labor. And when we're looking at division of labor, in economic systems, and basically whenever you see industrialization happen, we go from producing everything we need ourselves to factories starting to produce things and sell them to us rather than us making them ourselves. And you can say our country really went into high gear with industrialization in the late 1800s or the early 1900s. And you'll see things like the rise of the automobile industry as just an easy example. And one thing that made the automobile industry grow here was Henry Ford was in tune with the idea of the division of labor, and it really made him more productive. So division of labor is this: it's the assignment of different parts of a manufacturing process to different people or groups in order to improve efficiency, or we call that the assembly line. So Henry Ford pretty much perfected this idea. You know, if you take all the parts necessary to build a car and you just throw them all out there on the floor, and then you have 10 people trying to put it together, that's pretty chaotic. But if you put things on an assembly line and everyone has a specific job, and one person puts on tires and the other person puts in the motor and the other person puts on the windshield, it becomes very orderly. And the people who do those jobs do them over and over and over, and they get very good at it. So they specialize in their job and they can do it even faster. So we see the division of labor and giving each person a specific job to do in the manufacturing process really increases productivity. We mentioned specialization. If we look at it from a country standpoint, nations produce and export a limited assortment of goods for which they are well suited. This also increases productivity. Now what I want you to think about here, you take a country like the United States. What natural resources do we have? We have pretty much all the natural resources we need. We're very fortunate here in this country. You guys, I like to say you won the birth lottery. You were born into a country that pretty much has everything it needs. We have all the minerals, we have petroleum, we can grow enough food to feed ourselves. We have an area where we can grow all the cotton to produce the textiles we need. We can make everything here. Everything we need, we can make in the United States. And we used to do that. But what we've learned is it might be better to let some other countries produce some things, and we'll just stick with what we really do well. So we're going to specialize. What's the United States specialized in? I really wish we were in class right now so we could discuss this. But think for a second. What do you think the United States is really the best at, and it's really the things that we do in this country right now as far as production and manufacturing? Number one, well, I don't know if it's number one, but something we're really good at is technology. We develop technology here. Now, we may send products to other countries or have other countries build that technology for us, i.e. the iPhone, but we think it up here. So when it comes to technology, we're really, really good at that. Another thing we're really good at is making weapons. We can make aircraft, we can make guns. We're very good at producing the tools of war. So we still do those things here. We still have a lot of technology in the United States. We still produce a lot of arms and we sell them to other countries because we're really, really good at it. But once again, we've had the example of shoes. Do you think this shoe was made in the United States? And the answer is absolutely not. It was made in China. Can't we make shoes in the United States? We absolutely can, but we found out it's better to focus on what we're good. There's a little phrase that says, do what you do best and trade for the rest. And a lot of countries seem to have bought into that. But when we do this, it creates a notion of interdependence. That means we're all dependent on each other as a global economy. As countries become more specialized, they become more dependent on each other to supply their goods and services. Nowhere is this more apparent than if we look at what's happening right now with a global pandemic. You know, we rely on other countries to produce lots of things that we purchase just because it's cheaper that way. You know, I've been reading up on some pharmaceuticals, and it seems that China produces a very large number of the pharmaceuticals that we import into this country, and we don't make so many drugs here anymore. And people are starting to rethink that, especially with the pandemic going, is this really a good idea? Shouldn't the United States go back to producing a lot more of its own stuff rather than trading with other countries? But once again, the reason this happened was through specialization, we become more productive. And we let other countries produce things that we want to fool with, and we'll just trade back and forth. The last thing we'll talk about then would be productivity, which is the measure of output per unit of input. Let that sink in for a second. How much output a factory will produce as opposed to how much was put into it. So how efficient, really, that's what we're looking at. This includes labor and capital. Labor being the work that we do, it could be mental or physical. Capital being all the tools and machinery used to make other products. Output here is usually measured in revenue, which is just a fancy way to say money. And really what we're looking at here, it's a measure of how efficiently goods and services are produced. So what we want to do is increase our productivity. You take a country like the United States, who is very advanced technologically, even something like drilling for natural gas. We've developed systems here where we no longer just drill a hole straight down in the ground and hope we hit the gas. We can drill down in the ground a long way and then turn the bit to go maybe 7 or 8 or maybe 2,000-3,000 feet to the left or to the right, which allows us to find lots more natural gas that we wouldn't normally have found from just drilling holes straight down into the ground. So what we've done is, through technology, we've increased our productivity. So now one oil well can produce much more than it used to, maybe even just 20 years ago. So countries who are able to use technology to increase productivity, you're going to see their standard of living go up. And then once again, you look at some countries like Iraq or Iran, where they have vast amounts of natural resources like petroleum, but yet their standard of living is quite low because they don't really produce it very efficiently. And then the government does control a lot of that production, so it's not being shared with the people of those countries. So that pretty much wraps everything up today. We're looking at GDP, gross domestic product, and how we use that to measure how our country does as compared to other countries, and how our country does as compared to itself 5, 10, 15 years ago. So what we'll do is this wraps up all the notes. Tomorrow will be a review, and I think I'll just send you some PowerPoints to check out for a review. Then we will take our test on Friday. Now, before you panic about the test, it's probably going to be about 15 or 20 multiple choice questions. There will not be an open response. And I'm going to write the questions in such a way where you have to think, because once again, I can't just say, what is GDP? Because you can just look it up very easily, which you probably already know. So we're going to have more application, and you're going to apply your knowledge to more, to think things out. And once again, when you take your test, I don't mind at all for you having the notes out or having the PowerPoints out, or I know you have access to the internet, that's fine. But I just want you to think and know that those are the type questions that are coming. So I hope you're staying safe, hope everything's doing well, and I'll see you before long.